The latest machinery we had out, they'd be there copying everything that they had, and they went back and improved on it every time. And then I tell you, it made me kind of mad. I'm gonna be honest with you, because I knew I was making my living in that place at that time.
Well, you'd be surprised at what they're doing now. We were talking to the assistant manager and the vice president working with us, and he was saying that practically all the machinery is either Japanese or Belgian.
Well, that's where the last place I worked, that's where it come from. We had the looms come from Belgium.
Ron, how's the sound?
I can improve it just since they're all identical.
Okay, could you tell us how old you were when you started in the mills and all that stuff?
Battery.
Looking hot.
Okay. Sorry about that, but at least it happened early.
Yeah. Okay, tell me your story.
Well, I started in mills when I was 14 years old. And back in those days, they didn't do like you do today, where they pay you so much to learn what we call it, somebody to teach you and that. But you just went in and you got permission to go in, you know. And after you got that permission, they'd put you with somebody, either some of your family, in which I was fortunate. I had an older brother, and they put me with him. And sometimes that's not a good idea when you're working with your brother. You know, if you do the least little thing wrong, well, sometimes you get scolded pretty good. But anyway, that's where I started, and that was when I was just a boy.
When was that? And tell us what you did and what the conditions were like.
Well, back in those days, I believe it was 1929 when I went in just to work. And back then, well, it was right before the big bang went on, you know. But anyway, we made fairly good money back in those days. Well, you know, when you get about 14 years old, like I was, well, and you begin to make a little more than I was delivering papers, well, you say, well, that's for me, you know, in a way, but because you don't realize in the future what holds for you. But anyway, the people were very nice at that time. Now, back in those days when you lived on a mill village, they were your friends. If one of you got bad, sick, or any of those things, they helped one another. And they did the same in the plants, the same way. And you're going to always find a few, you know, that wouldn't agree with everything. But generally, it was pretty nice. And then when the stock market crash come along, well, then things began to get a little rough. Most people didn't have no jobs. And but I got a job after I was about 16 in the plant. I believe I mentioned that before, about I had to draw straws for that job. Well, we call it that, but it's two men had pencils. You could walk in the plants back in those days, not like you are today, where you got fences around them and guards and things. And I went in right at the change of shifts. They didn't have but 2 shifts. But anyway, I went in at that time, and I happened to get that job, but I was sorry of it before that night, because that was one of the hardest jobs I ever had in my life. But anyway, that's when I started in that, and I got at another plant, and I stayed with it for a good many years because they were good to you, just like family. In fact, if you needed a little money at this particular company that I worked for at that time, on up to I was about 17, 18 years old. If you happened to need it, of course at that time I wasn't married, I didn't need it. But if you did, you could go to them, and if there was legitimate reason, well, they'd give you the money and take it off of your pay, you know, so much a week, pay it back. But some of you people got sick and had to go at the hospital. There wasn't no hospitalizations or anything like that back in those days. And sometimes you would have to do that, you know, if you got in a bad bind. And so they would always look after you, especially the company I worked for. In fact, they were too lenient. I'll have to say that after I got older and working at different places, I realized how lenient they really were, because it was an independent company now. It wasn't a big outfit. But most of even the big outfits back in those days, they were good. And they called us lint heads and things that way. But most of us, we had a lot of fun too now. And then we had trials and troubles like everybody does. But I don't regret it. I had a good life.
Tell us about the fun you had.
Well, you take on the weekends and you get off from work. Well, back then when it first started, you know, you worked I worked 12 hours. I'd go to work. Of course, I was younger and I was newer. I'd have to go to work at 6 o'clock and work at 6 the next morning. And but now on the weekend, well, you'd go out and have your fun just like any young fellow would, you know. And I enjoyed that. Go out and maybe sometime go out of town and things of that sort. So if you find somebody that had a car. But I enjoyed it back in the early 30s I'm talking about, because the whole country was in a depression, as you know, at that particular time. But there's always a way to have fun, but you had to usually make your own. There wasn't drive-ins that you went to like a later they had and all these things that you'd go to, but we had places that you could always go and have fun.
Tell us about what happened when President Roosevelt got elected.
Well, I think everybody, especially down through here, was thrilled to death about that, because you know.
It started off when Roosevelt got elected.
Yeah, when he got elected.
Sorry, when did you say Roosevelt?
Yeah, when Roosevelt got elected, well, he was a man that people had confidence in. You know, he said you have nothing to fear but fear itself. Well, people loved that, and they'd have those fireside chats that they called it, and people. When they'd go and have one, well, naturally everybody, especially in the textiles, would be sitting there by that radio listening to hear him make that speech. And everybody, well, everything began to bloom, you know. The first thing he did was close the banks, and some of them didn't open, but all at the same time, at that, it straightened the country out to a certain extent, and everybody was real pleased with President Roosevelt.
What about how did that affect your pay and your hours of work?
Oh my goodness, big change, because back before that, well, you could work for almost nothing. I worked myself for, maybe I ought not say it, but it's because I really did, but I was just a boy, but 12.5 cents an hour back at that time on some jobs. You know, of course, that was just a menial job. But after he come in and he started what they call, I'm going back in history, and you all know all this, but the NRA, and then they started this 40-hour work, and they had to pay you 40 cents an hour, if I remember correctly. 40 cents an hour, where regardless of what, they had to pay you. Well, now that hurt the manufacturers some. They said, oh, they'd go broke. They couldn't afford to do that. They couldn't afford to pay people 8 hours pay. Well, I believe, what did it amount up to? About $40 a week and 40 hours, and anyway, about $12 a week, somewhere along in there. But anyway, whatever it was, they said they couldn't do it. But after they found out in a while, they got more production in the 8-hour and the 40-hour week than they did when we was working 50 and 55. So you didn't hear too much about that and that's when the country started, and then it wasn't, of course, it's in 37, 38, along in that, well, things began to get a little rough again in the textile industry. And then, but it straightened out some, and everything got to going along pretty good, and the war come along then, you know. And so then everybody had to work, in which that was a terrible thing that happened, but it did put people to work, you know.
Could you tell us, okay?
Just a moment.
Now,
Sorry, go ahead.
I want you to tell me, you were, at that time, tell us what you did in 33, 34, what kind of a job you had, and then how that was affected when they started getting more production out of you.
Well, back then it was I was a weaver, and naturally you got paid by your production work, and they didn't have all things that they got today, like pick clocks, but that eventually come. But they paid you by the cut of cloth that you had. They'd have, you'd be weaving, and every weaver, well, he'd have 2 red spots between on every, I don't know how many yards, I can't remember now. But anyway, you'd cut between those 2 red marks. You'd leave one on the roller when you roll it back up, and you'd leave one on the cloth that went to the cloth room. And that was simply because to keep the people maybe from cutting some off and taking some of the cloth. But you got paid so much by the cuts that you took off. But after that come along, and they had it all figured out, I mean, about the way it was supposed to be, and come out about the same. But now if you did not make the 40 cents an hour at the end of the week in your production, of course I was fortunate, I believe I failed at one time. But whenever you made over it, they'd take it back off of your pay on the next, say the next week, you see, you'd maybe have more cuts of cloth to take off. And if you made way over the allotted amount, well, they'd take back what you owed them from that. But that was really against the law. I don't know who turned it in, but somebody at the plant that I worked at that particular time, they undoubtedly turned it in, and they sent a man down from the government to check it out. And he'd call each individual up to the office and he'd interview them. And so some of them, old guys, it maybe took $10, maybe $12 off of them over a period of time now. And so they took us one by one up there. But they had to make that good. They had to pay all that back because it is against the law for them to do that.
Do you remember the BEDO system?
No, sir. No,
it was
sir.
just one of the ways of, they use the term stretch out. Did that mean anything to you?
Oh, yes. Oh,
Talk about
yes.
the
Now,
stretch out.
well, now.
Using that term.
All right, and a stretch out, what you call a stretch out would be, well, I said I was a weaver. All right. Say I'm running, back where I worked at that particular time, I was on running ginghams. It had 4 shuttles in that loom. It had you'd put 4 different colors in it, and your woof was colored too, had the stripes. Well, you'd mix it in and match it up. And, well, we usually run about 12, maybe looms. Well, they come along and said, no, we're going to have to give you more because things are getting rough. And when you call stretching out, to say in place of giving you 12, you're going to have to run 2 more looms, say 14 or either 15, but you wouldn't make any more money. And sometimes you wouldn't make quite as much because you'd have so much on you couldn't get to them as quick and start them up and get them back into production again. And that's what the stretch out was. It's where you just add more work to you for the same pay or maybe less pay.
How did you feel about that?
Well, I don't think any of us liked it about that because, naturally it made you work harder and more pressure on you and all these things. But now to get back to if I can, in these times, at this particular time, most of us lived in what you call a company house. Well, the rent wasn't much, but here's what most of the people that worked in there had to think about. If you worked for that company and you quit, or either you got fired, you had to leave that house. They give you so many days, and if you didn't move, it'd put you out. So it was kind of put you in a bind, and actually it more or less it motivates you to make you do more than what you're really sometimes capable of doing. Some people was, and most of the times when they'd have what we call efficiency men to come through. Of course, they didn't have too many of those back in those days, thank the Lord for that. But they always, efficiency man, he'd want to pick out the very best, and this is after I got to be supervising in the plants. He'd want to pick out the very best in that kind of job that you had. Want the very best. Well, naturally, he made it look easy, or she would make it look easy. And you go to compare, and maybe you had about 12 or 15 people doing that same kind of work. they couldn't compare with that fella, that lady, because it just felt natural to them, and that made it hard too, because they figure your production from that very good one, the very best you had, and that made it a little hard too, and that's part of the stretching out too system, you know.
Now, there was a big strike all over the country in textiles in '34. Do you think that the stretch out had anything to do with it?
I feel sure that it did have something to do, because
Just as I said, I sure the stretch out. That's
yeah, and the stretch out, I feel sure that did have something to do with it. Of course, that wasn't all of it. You know, there's a lot of money involved in it too, but I feel sure that's what it was, is wanting to cut down on the workload and still make more money. Well, you know, that's a hard thing to come by. So we had a lot of troubles in that, and about, well, I should not say troubles, but we had some plants that they refused to. They talked to the help, and I come back to the situation I was telling you about, living in these company houses, and one in particular here in this town. Well, they even had the National Guard to come out to where you could not. They had them posted, said, this is private property, you absolutely are not going to go in there. Well, back during that strike, people would go to these plants and try to get, in march, so to speak, be maybe hundreds in that group would march down there and try to get them. Well, when you'd come to some of them where they'd have these, well, there's National Guards on some of them, they'd call them out to come out where you could guard the roads to where you wouldn't let you down in there. And that caused a lot of hard feelings back during those days, because some of the people that it was working, well, they couldn't hardly leave the village where they were at, because if they did, you know, they're afraid somebody may hurt them. But I wasn't in anything like that, but I've heard some of the people talk that worked at in these places at that time. You know, naturally they call them scabs and this and that and the other, but these people that worked in there said most of the time the company would furnish them whatever they needed, you know, mostly to keep them happy, because they knew they couldn't get out to do no good. They could get out, and they'd probably have to have, maybe, I don't know whether they had to have a pass or anything, get back in or not, but as far as a group marching in down in some of the places, you couldn't do it.
Now, you told me that you joined the union. Could you talk about that, why you did and how you felt about it?
Well, I did join it at one time.
I did join the union.
Yes, I did join the union at one time, but it was for a very short time. I don't think I even paid a due, simply because you want me to mention about what I told you about one time before about
Sure.
Well, this place struck, and I wasn't in favor of it, because this place I was telling you about a while ago, they're so good to the people. They really were. And anyway, we did. I walked out with them. Well, the next day, I go fishing. Well, when I come in that evening late, that night rather, there's some men standing there, and they wanted to know if I would be on the committee. And I said, well, I'm a young man. And I said, you need an older man on that job. I don't believe I want to do that. I don't want to do that. They say, well, we had a meeting today, and you are the one that said they wanted you on the committee because the people had confidence in you. And I said, well, I appreciate that, but I think you need an older and a wiser man, because I'm young. I believe at that time I wasn't about 22, maybe somewhere along there. But they said no, and I said, well, if it'll satisfy you, I'll try it. Well, I did. So we went up and we had a meeting, and they brought the books out. They laid them out there on the table. They didn't try to hide anything. I'll have to say that and be honest with the company now. Sure, look at them papers, no more education I got. I know them people wasn't making no money. And I said, I don't know. I said, these people can't afford to do that. Well, you know, when you go back and tell the people in the meetings, oh, so I don't know, they can't do that. Say that according to the books, they just haven't got the money to do it. Well, the people don't much want to believe that. So anyway, that drags on, the strike drags on. And well, we'd have another meeting, and what maybe fall out with the union. We went back up out of this place, and it was in the hot summertime. And there wasn't no air conditioners and things like you got today. And it was a nice office, great big old conference table there, and we sit around the table. And the man that owned the plant, he said, well, there's a store right up above there, just a few 100 yards. He said, I'm going to send up there and get us something cold to drink. And he did. He bought us all a Coca-Cola. And well, naturally, it tasted good to me. It really did. One of the little old teeny Cokes, you know, back in them days. It didn't cost me, I believe, about 6 cents, something like that. But anyway, first thing I heard when I come out the door from the meeting, you know, how they gathered around out there, you know, what's going on, find out what's going on when you come out. Well, they bought you off with a Coca-Cola. I said, oh my goodness. Nah, I'm in the wrong business. Well, I'm not one that wants to quit right off, you know. But I said, man, what's the matter with you people? That's just one individual telling me that. But I figured by them others listening, some of them probably maybe thought the same thing, you know. But I know they didn't all think that. But anyway, we stuck that thing out. Well, several weeks, maybe a couple of months. I can't remember how long. But anyway, everybody was going in debt, you know. They didn't have no unemployment. Well, you couldn't get it if you was on strike anyway, but they didn't have all that kind of things back in those days. Well, but I was fortunate. I had a place that, well, whatever I needed, this man always supplied with my groceries and all that thing, but I had to pay it back when I went back to work. I was in debt. But anyway, you go to thinking back about the union. That fixed me up. After we got that settled, they got a man from the state to finally come down, from the State Board of Labor. And he come, and he looked at it, and he come back, and he told us the same thing. He said, man, they about broke. They can't pay you nothing. But we finally got cut. What we finally got was we got cut down from the loan. I believe we was running 15, and it cut us down to 13. So we got that much off of it, you know. But that fixed me up with the union. I never did have nothing else to do with the union. Now a lot of people, the union helped us in one way. I'll have to say that because, you know, I imagine even if we didn't finally join the union and all of that, keep up with it with the dues and things, when the others got a raise, well, naturally they had to come along and take care of that too.
Now, could you repeat again just the story that you'd never paid any dues? How could you be a member of the union for that long and not pay dues?
Well, see, we was just a foreman one. I wasn't a member, really. Well, I can't say that I was a member. I can't say that I was a member because I might have got a card or something. I believe I did, but I never did pay no money. You know, you joined, but you had to go to work before you could pay. So I never did pay.
The reason I'm asking that is that we were in Columbus, and the woman was saying that they formed a union, and everybody paid money, and then the fellow ran off with the money.
Well, that happened. That happened right here in this place.
Could you tell about that?
Well, I don't know all about it, but I just heard about it and read about it. Can't even remember who the fellas were, but they were. That happened. What they told me, the people in the union. Well, you know, to me that hurts. The men that had the treasure and had the money, well, in places they're supposed to be taking up for the working people, they left with the money. And it's hard. The Southern people, I love them. I'm a Southerner myself, and man, I'm proud of it. But I want to tell you one thing. If each one of us is an individual, if we don't agree, we usually tell you right off, and I think you know that. And so that's what happened a lot of times in that, is where we just couldn't stick together. Each man be a little independent, you know. May not have nothing, but you'd have independent. I've known them, and I've had people in later years that work with me, and and I know that they didn't have nothing on but what little check that they'd come in, because I lived around them and I'd give them their check. And man, if they get mad at you, they'd quit that quick. That didn't bother them a bit. That's how independent most people. And that might not be that way today, but even back then during the hard times, you didn't press too much on a job, because that's one right there to say, I got a right to quit anytime I want to, and you have. You might suffer for it, but you can quit.
Now, tell about how you got to be a supervisor.
Well, I worked at it some. I tell you, when I was weaving, and if I got caught up, you know.
Sorry, let's start with just saying how much education you have, and then.
Oh, I just had. I didn't go no farther than the 7th grade. I went through the 7th grade. That's as far as I went. I wish I'd have went farther. My mother cried when I told her I wasn't going to go back. But the reason why is back during that Depression. And so they didn't have the money. You know, back then you had to buy all your books. You had to pay a fee when you went in and all that. Well, I knew they didn't have that money. They really didn't. I had a paper route now, and I was delivering papers. And a lot of times I couldn't make 25 or 50 cents in a week, because the people didn't have. They wanted the paper, but they couldn't pay for it. You know, in a paper boy, you buy the papers from the company, and you're responsible for the money. Well, if you collect enough, you got to pay your paper bill, and what's left is yours. If you didn't have a 15, 20 cents, that was what you worked that week for. That was it. But to get back to telling you about me becoming a supervisor, I would try, when I was weaving, I watched the loom fixer when he'd fix a loom. And naturally you round them all these hours, well, you're gonna learn something about it if you're interested in it at all. And then I got to where I'd try to fix my own, you know, if some little something, I'm talking about some small, where it wouldn't take you but a few minutes to fix it. When I got the rest of my looms running, maybe the loom fixer would be slow getting there. Well, you know, when your looms are not running, you're not making any money either. And I'd go to them and I'd say, give me a wrench to do this or do that, you know. I want to put this on, put that. If I needed some little something like a picker or something, well, give me one, I'll put it on right quick. Well, they would. And well, I'd do that, and I reckon maybe the boss got to noticing about me being a little, wanting to get ahead, I reckon. And so I just kept moving up from that, because every job I ever went on, I'd try to improve on it, because I felt this way. If I'm going to have to stay in this place for 8 hours, or whatever the hours may be, I want the highest paying job that's in this department. All I got to sell is my services. And I'm trying to sell my services, and I want all I can get for my services. And that's the way I looked at it. And I worked up through that, and people took a notice of that, I reckon, by me. Maybe I didn't rush right out a lot of times. Time I was get through with a certain thing and on my job. Like most of the people that worked in there, they'd watch the clock. And they'd watch the lights. Back then they'd flash lights for change of shift or something like that. And then finally got to where they'd blow the horn, but it's hard to hear in the weave room. But anyway, that's the way I got in there, but just taking a little more time and letting them know that I cared. And so I think most people took a notice of that. And one day there's a job come open, and I told this fella, I can remember his name well, his name was Lamar Lightsey. And I asked Mr. Lightsey, I said, I can do that job if you can see fit to let me try it. He said, well, I'll think about it. Well, he come back later and he told me to try it. And that's the way I got started. That's exactly.
How long were you a supervisor? Okay, hold it just a minute. Going very